Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western Literary Canon out loud. Today, we are continuing our series on Emerson's journals. Of course, we are in the thick of it, and we are up to journal collection number 53, and this dates from the year or spans the year 1862, and Emerson will turn 59 years old in this year. And like many of his journal collections, they start with one or more quotations from various authors. And a lot of times the editors will give us those in English, but not so much as we get into uh, the midst of the journals. After that, it's very seldom that you'll see actual translation, even though Emerson gives a lot of quotations throughout his journal entries. Anyway, I'll read. There's three of these. The first is by Heraclitus, and the second is from the Iliad, book 7, and then the last is from someone named Elphinstone, and I've never heard of this person, but we'll read what that person has to say. So the first entry, Heraclitus. War is the father of all things. Quote, we sung the mass of lances from morn until the night, end quote. Quote, not hate but glory bade these chiefs contend, and each brave foe was in his soul a friend. End quote. And that one's from the Iliad, book 7. Quote, faults lay on either side of the Trojan towers, end quote. And that's from the aforementioned Elphinstone. Editor's note. Even thus early, the cost of the war began to be felt at the North, though of course far less than at the South. In a letter to his brother William, quoted more fully in the memoir by Mr. Cabot, Volume 2, page 612, Mr. Emerson says, quote, the 1st of January has found me in quite as poor a plight as the rest of the Americans. Not a penny from my books since last June, which usually yield 500 or 600 a year. No dividends from the banks. Almost all income from lectures has quite ceased. Meantime, we are trying to be as unconsuming as candles under an extinguisher. But far better that this grinding should go on, bad and worse, than we be driven by any impatience into a hasty peace, or any peace restoring the old rottenness. End quote. End of note. January 9th, 1862. Memory. We should so gladly find the law of thought unmechanical, that 'tis a linked chain, drop one link and there is no recovery. When newly awakened from lively dreams, we are so near them, still in their sphere. Give us one syllable, one feature, one hint, and we should repossess the whole. Hours of this strange entertainment and conversation would come trooping back to us. But we cannot get our hand on the first link or fiber, and the whole is forever lost. There is a strange willfulness in the speed in which it disperses and baffles your grasp. I ought to have preserved the medical journal's notice of RWE in Philadelphia, that of all the persons on the platform, Mr. Emerson was the least remarkable looking, etc., which I could very often match with experiences in hotels and in private circles, as at the Mayor Elgie's in Worcester, England. Besides, I am not equal to any interview with able, practical men. Nay, every boy out-argues or outstates me, insults over me, and leaves me rolling in the dirt. Each thinks that 'tis he who has done it, and I know that everybody does or can as much. J.T. Payne of Charlestown said to me that he had noticed that Englishmen never presume to go behind the workmen whom they employ. If they order a coat, or a trunk, or a house, or a ship, they call in the proper person to make it, and they accept what he gives them, whilst an American makes himself a very active party to the whole performance. Cannot we let people be themselves, and enjoy life in their own way? You are trying to make that man another you. One's enough. Sympathy, yes, but not surrender. When I fancy that all the farmers are despairing in the drought or the forest, I meet Edmund Hosmer and find him serene, and making very slight account of the circumstance. In the cars, we all read the same full bulletin and smile or scowl as one man, and they who come to ask my opinion find me only one flat looking-glass more, when I ought to have stayed at home in my mind, and to have afforded them the quite inestimable element of a new native opinion or feeling, of a new quality. John Quincy Adams engraved on his seal, Herit, and the footnote states that means, may it stick. The use of quote-unquote occasional poems is to give leave to originality. To what purpose make more big books of statistics of slavery? There are already mountains of facts, if anyone wants them. Sources of inspiration. Solitary converse with nature is, perhaps, the first, and there are ejaculated sweet and dreadful words never uttered in libraries. Ah, the spring days, summer dawns, and October woods. Talent without character is friskiness. The charm of Montaigne's egotism and of his anecdotes is that there is a stout cavalier, a seigneur of France at home in his chateau, responsible for all this chatting. And if it could be shown to be a jeu d'esprit of Scaliger or other scribaceous person written for the booksellers, and not resting on a real status picturesque in the eyes of all men, it would lose all its value. But Montaigne is essentially unpoetic. January 16th. It occurred yesterday, after my conversation with the chickadee, that the illusions are many and pure. Each has his own, and all are tripped up by one or the other. The men of hard heart and iron will, old merchants and lawyers, fall an early prey to Mother Deb Sacco and Hume and the rappers, and converse with their dead aunts, like Dr. Hare and Mr. S. and H. Meanwhile, the subtlest intellectualist, Alcott, runs about for books which he does not understand, and which makes a dilettante of him, and making thus scholars his inferiors, his superiors, and forfeiting his immense and unique genius, to which all books are trivial. Then again, the question recurs daily, how far to respect the illusions? You cannot unmask or snub them with impunity. I know the hollowness and superstition of a dinner. Yet a certain health and good repair of social status comes of the habitude and well-informed chat there which have great market value, though none to my solitude. The war is a new glass to see our old things through, how they look. Some of our trades stand the test well. Baking and butchering are good under all skies and times. Farming, haying, and wood chopping don't go out of vogue. Meat and coal and shoes we must have, but coach painting and bronze match holders we can postpone for a while yet. Yet the music was heard with as much appetite as ever, and our quintets had only to put the Star-Spangled Banner into the program to gain a hurrah beside. But the concert could have prospered well without, and so if the Union were beaten and Jeff Davis ruled Massachusetts, these flutes and fiddles would have piped and scraped all the same, and no questions asked. It only shows that those fellows have hitched on their apple cart to a star, and so it gets dragged by might celestial. They know that few have thoughts or benefits, but all have ears, that the blood rolls to pulse beat and tune, that the babe rhymes and the boy whistles, and they throw themselves on a want so universal, and as long as birds sing, ballad singers will, and organ grinders will grind out their bread. January 17th. We will not again disparage America, now that we have seen what men it will bear. What a certificate of good elements in the soil, climate, and institutions is Lowell, whose admirable verses I have just read. Such a creature more accredits the land than all the fops of Carolina discredit it. Long ago I wrote of gifts, and neglected a capital example. John Thoreau, Jr. one day put up a bluebird box on my barn. 15 years ago it must be, and there it is still with every summer a melodious family in it, adorning the place and singing his praises. There's a gift for you which costs the giver no money, but nothing he could have bought would be so good. I think of another quite inestimable. John Thoreau, Jr. knew how much I should value a head of little Waldo, then 5 years old. He came to me and offered to carry him to a daguerreotypist, who was then in town, and he, Thoreau, would see it well done. He did it, and brought me the daguerre, which I thankfully paid for. And a few months after, my boy died, and I have ever since had deeply to thank John Thoreau for that wise and gentle piece of friendship. Old age. As we live longer, it looks as if our company were picked out to die first, and we live on in a lessening minority. In England, I have lost John Sterling, Samuel Brown, David Scott, Edward Forbes, Arthur Clow in Rome, Paul Akers, Mrs. Browning, Margaret Fuller, Giles Waldo. Here dies last week the excellent Mary H. Russell, and I am ever threatened by the decay of Henry Thoreau. In the footnote it states, already in advanced consumption, of which disease his sister and perhaps his father had died. There was a constant irritant to the lungs in the house, as their black lead for the electrotypers, though ground in Acton, was packed at home, and its impalpable powder settled in all parts of the house. A year before, Henry became thoroughly chilled, sitting in deep snow while he counted the growth rings on the stump of a huge tree. Unable to shake off his increasing cough and weakness after this exposure, he went with Horace Mann, Jr. in the late summer of 1861 on a trip to Minnesota, but without benefit. End of footnote. Opinion. Fluxional quantities. Fluxions, I believe, treat of flowing numbers, as for example the path through space of a point on the rim of a cartwheel. Flowing or varying. Most of my values are very variable. My estimate of America, which sometimes runs very low, sometimes to ideal prophetic proportions. My estimate of my own mental means and resources is all or nothing. In happy hours, life looking infinitely rich and sterile at others. My value of my club is as elastic as steam or gunpowder, so great now, so little anon. Literature looks now all sufficient, but in high and happy conversation it shrinks away to poor experimenting. Quote, in civil wars, which our ancestors never once experienced, but our times often have, all the conditions are pitiable, but none more than actual victory, for even should it come to the better men, yet it makes them more savage and more powerless, since even by nature they are not so, they are forced to become so. For many acts have to be done, even against his wishes, by the conqueror at the will of those by whose help he has won. Cicero, Letter to Marcus Marcellus. Every principle is a war note. Though practically nothing is so improbable or perhaps impossible a contingency for me, yet I do not wish to abdicate so extreme a privilege as the use of the sword or the bullet, for the peace of the man who has forsworn the use of the bullet seems to me not quite peace. Quote, whilst a citizen of Massachusetts can traverse the whole extent of the British Empire, and whatever his color, creed, or condition at home, his natural rights shall be as firmly protected as those of the Queen on her throne. The moment he crosses the line which divides the slave from non-slave states, he is subject to indignities and lawless outrage unsurpassed by the selfish cruelty of the most wild and inhospitable barbarians. G.W. Bassett. Quote, sovereignty ceases with the transgression of natural justice. Then the sovereign, whether a monarch or a tyrannical majority, becomes himself the culprit, and justly subject to any righteous power that may restrain him. Also from G.W. Bassett. See to it, not that the Republic receives no detriment, but that liberty receives no detriment. Happily, we are under better guidance than of statesmen. We are drifting in currents, and the currents know the way. It is, as I said, a war of instincts. Then I think the difference between our present and our past state is in our favor. It was war then and is war now, but war declared is better than undeclared war. The Southerners complain of, quote, the electing of Lincoln by insulting majorities, end quote. Quote, the wounds inflicted by iron are to be healed by iron and not by words, end quote. Custom makes the soldier. English nationality is very babyish, and most exhibitions of nationality are babyish. Our commerce has somewhat grand in its power. The telegraph enterprise was grand in design and is already of immense benefit. But our politics are pretty and expectant. The government is paralyzed, the army paralyzed, and we are waiters on Providence. Better for us, perhaps, that we should be ruled by slow heads than by bold ones, whilst insight is withheld. Yet one conceives of a head capable of taking in all the elements of this problem: the blockade, the stone fleet, the naval landings, insurrection, English ill will, French questionability, Texas. Governments are mercantile, interested, and not heroic. Governments of nations of shopkeepers must keep shop also. There is very little in our history that rises above commonplace. In the Greek Revolution, Clay and Webster persuaded the Congress into some qualified declaration of sympathy. Once we tendered Lafayette a national ship, gave him an ovation and a tract of public land, 200,000 acres. We attempted some testimony of national sympathy to Kossuth in Hungary. We subscribed and sent out corn and money to the Irish famine. These were spasmodic demonstrations. They were ridiculed as sentimentalism. They were sentimentalism, for it was not our natural attitude. We are not habitually and at home philanthropists, no, but timorous, sharp shopmen, and each excuses himself, if he talks politics, for leaving his proper province, and we really care for our shop and family, and not for Hungary and Greece, except as an opera, private theatricals, or public theatricals. And so of slavery, we have only half a right to be so good, for temperament cracks the whip in every northern kitchen. Government has no regard for men until they become property. Then it has the tenderest. The thinking class are looked at inquisitively in these times by the actors, as if some counsel were expected from them. But the thinker seldom speaks to the actor in his time, but ever to actors in the next age. Milton and Algernon Sidney were not listened to in their own time, but now are consulted with profit, and have just authority. The philosopher speaks over the heads of the contemporary audience to that advancing assembly he sees beyond, as Dr. Reed of Bridgewater, after he was blind, preaching one day in his church, saw the congregation, nor did it occur to him that it was strange that he should see them until he left the church. Then he asked his son if he had said or done anything unusual today. His son said he had observed nothing more than that he spoke with unusual animation. But the doctor bethought him that he had seen the congregation, yet that the persons composing it were strange to him, and not his old acquaintances of the town, and asked himself if it were perhaps an audience of persons in the spiritual world. In lack of affirmatives, negatives. One of the best of our defenses is this bad one, that such is the levity and impatience of the mind that tyranny and any falsehood becomes a bore at last, as well as Aristides. And nations get weary of hearing of the divine origin of popery and of slavery. There came a day when union saving became ridiculous. It is much as we used to comfort ourselves when Douglas threatened to be president, that his habits were bad, and that he was killing himself with whiskey, or the assurances of Louis Napoleon's failing health, with which the English journals periodically console their readers, or as when we meet a prosperity, because our enemy has made a blunder. We shall never be saved so. This world belongs to the energetical. England has no higher worship than fate. She lives in the low plain of the winds and waves, watches like a wolf a chance for plunder, values herself as she becomes wind and wave in the low circle of natural hunger and greed. Never a lofty sentiment, never a duty to civilization, never a generosity, a moral self-restraint. In sight of a commodity, her religion, her morals are forgotten. Why need we be religious? Have I not bishops and clergy at home punctually praying and sanctimonious from head to foot? Have they not been paid their last year's salary? Wherever snow falls, man is free. Where the orange blooms, man is the foe of man. President Lincoln said well that, quote, the rebels carried only the ruin of their own country as ground to invoke the aid of foreign nations, end quote. Certainly it were happier if energy, if genius should appear in the government to enact and transcend the desires of the people, but that is too much to hope for, as it is more than we deserve. For how can the people censure the government as dilatory and cold, the people which it has been so cold and slow itself at home? I say it were happier, if genius should appear in the government, but if it do not, we have got the first essential element, namely honesty, and let us hold that gift dear. Our only safe rule in politics heretofore was always to believe that the worst would be done. Then we were not deceived. I conceive the strength of the North to lie in 1. Its moral rectitude on this matter, 2. Its genius, manners, habits, tenure of land and climate, all which indispose it to slavery. Its weakness to lie in its timorous literalism. Revolution. In 1848, a surprising discovery was that Paris was the capital of Europe. Both government and people throughout Germany took no primary step, but waited for Paris and made that their model. And then there is a long French quotation here from Gaston Bozier, Revue des Deux Mondes. I'm not sure what it's about. The government is not to be blamed. The government, with all its merits, is to be thanked and praised for its angelic virtue compared with anything we have known for long. It is impossible to extricate oneself from the questions in which your age is involved. You can no more keep out of politics than you can keep out of the frost. Shall it be said of America as of Russia, quote, it was a fine fruit spoiled before it had ripened, end quote. Don't underestimate the wish to make out a presentable cause before foreign nations. We wish to come into court with clean hands, and looking at our affair through the eyes of France or England or Germany, through the eyes of liberal foreigners, wonderfully helps our common sense to rally. Now the world is full of maxims to this purport, quote, there can be no true valor in a bad cause, end quote. Quote, one omen is good, to fight for one's country, end quote. Quote, ye shall not count dead, but living, those who are slain in the way of God, end quote. Quote, be sure you are right, then go ahead, end quote. It is of immense force that you go for a public and universal end, and not for your pot and pantry. Then not only England and Austria, but the youth everywhere are with you. Woman is with you, genius is, religion is. Otherwise you are working against the grain. You have seen a carpenter on a ladder with a broad axe chopping upward chips and slivers from a beam. How awkward. Hitch your wagon to a star. Do the like in your choice of tasks. Let us not fag in paltry, selfish tasks which aim at private benefit alone. No, God will help. We shall find all the teams going the other way. Charles is Wayne, the Great Bear, Orion, Leo, Hercules. Every god will leave us. Let us work rather for those interests which the gods honor and promote: justice, love, utility, freedom, knowledge. Ideas impregnable. Numbers are nothing. Who knows what was the population of Jerusalem? 'Tis of no importance whatever. We know that the saint and a handful of people held their great thoughts to the death, and that the mob rejected and killed them, and at the hour fancied they were up and he was down, when at that very moment the fact was the reverse. The principles triumphed and had begun to penetrate the world, and 'tis never of any account how many or how rich people resist a thought. Culture. The world is full of pot and pan policy. Every nation is degraded by the hobgoblins it worships instead of the eternal gods. Thus popery, thus Calvinism, thus tariff, thus mesmerism, thus custom, thus luxury, thus slavery, and civility as it advances to light casts away these crusts for simple food, sense, and universal modes. Indianapolis, January 26th. Titan I have read on this journey, and for its noble wisdom and insight forgive. What still annoys me, its excessive efflorescence in German superlative. How like to Goethe's Wilhelm Meister in its culture, names, and wisdom. Rome is the best part of it, and therein it resembles Goethe the more. Quote, Never was there a jar or discord between genuine sentiment and sound policy. Burke. Editor's note. Mr. Emerson was invited to the National Capitol to give a lecture before the Smithsonian Institution on January 31st. In the first days of the war, he had given in Boston a lecture which he called Civilization at a Pinch. This he expanded to meet the conditions of the hour. The unexpected length and magnitude of the strife and the increased perception by the Northern people that slavery was the basal cause of this upheaval and must be faced and dealt with before any lasting peace could come. Negroes already flocked into every camp. A policy must be decided on. Those who stayed on the plantations raised the corn and bacon to feed the Southern armies, and thus allowed every able-bodied white to serve in the army. From 1844, when Mr. Emerson made his address celebrating the success of England's act of justice and humanity by emancipating her slaves in her West Indian possessions, he had always stood for emancipation in the United States, also urging a fair compensation to the quote-unquote owners. Now the hour seemed to have struck. The South had forced the issue, and a brave and just man filled the presidential chair. The gate of opportunity opened before Mr. Emerson to urge, perhaps in the presence of the men guiding the course of the country, the one great act of justice so long deferred, which would hasten the coming of peace and wipe out a national stain. There has been some doubt whether Lincoln heard this earnest plea. Mr. M.D. Conway, in his Emerson at Home and Abroad, states that the President and members of his cabinet were present. In answer to inquiries made in 1886, the Librarian of Congress wrote that the Washington newspapers of the day, in their notices of the lecture, did not mention that these officials were in the audience, and he thought it unlikely, as also did Mrs. Nicolay and Hay, Lincoln's secretaries. As for Mr. Lincoln, quote, he was very busy at that time, Stanton, the new War Secretary, having just come in and storming like a fury at the business of his department. It is worth remarking that Mr. Emerson clearly foreshadowed the policy of emancipation some 6 or 8 months in advance of Mr. Lincoln. He saw the logic of events leading up to a crisis in our affairs to, quote, emancipation as a platform with compensation to loyal owners, end quote, his words as reported in the Star. The notice states that the lecture was fully attended, end quote. At a much later date, Miss Boutwell, the daughter of the late distinguished senator from Massachusetts, wrote, quote, I was present at that lecture, as were also my father and mother. I have a very positive recollection that President Lincoln was there, that he sat in one of the front seats. I can recall in my mind how he looked and where he sat. We were only a few seats behind him. Mother and I have spoken of the fact, and father's memory confirms mine, end quote. The greater part of this lecture is printed in Civilization, Society in Solitude, and American Civilization, Miscellanies. End note. From War. Visit to Washington, 31st January, 1862. At Washington, January 31st, February 1, 2, and 3, saw Sumner, who on the 2nd carried me to Mr. Chase, Mr. Bates, Mr. Stanton, Mr. Wells, Mr. Seward, Lord Lyons, and President Lincoln. The President impressed me more favorably than I had hoped. A frank, sincere, well-meaning man with a lawyer's habit of mind. Good, clear statement of his fact, correct enough, not vulgar, as described, but with a sort of boyish cheerfulness. or that kind of sincerity and jolly good meaning that our class meetings on commencement day show in telling our old stories over. When he has made his remark, he looks up at you with great satisfaction, and shows all his white teeth and laughs. He argued to Sumner the whole case of Gordon, the slave trader, point by point, and added that he was not quite satisfied yet, and meant to refresh his memory by looking again at the evidence. All this showed a fidelity and conscientiousness very honorable to him. When I was introduced to him, he said, "Oh, Mr. Emerson, I once heard you say in a lecture that a Kentuckian seems to say by his air and manners, 'Here am I, if you don't like me, the worse for you.'" In the Treasury building, I saw in an upper room a number of people, say 20 or 30, seated at long tables, all at work upon Treasury notes, some cutting and some filling up, etc., but the quantity under their multitudinous operation looked like paper hangings. And when I saw Mr. Chase, I told him I thought the public credit required the closing of that door on the promenaders of the gallery. Mr. Hooper told me that in the manufacture of 1,000,000 notes, I think, $66 disappeared. Mr. Stanton, who resembles Charles R. Train, although a heavier and better head and eye, made a good impression as of an able, determined man, very impatient of his instruments, and though he named nobody, I thought he had McClellan in mind. When somewhat was said of England, he said, "England is to be met in Virginia. Mud. Oh yes, but there has been mud before. Ah, the difficulty isn't outside, 'tis inside." He had heard that Governor Andrew had come to the city to see him about the Butler Andrew difficulty. "Well, why doesn't he come here? If I could meet Governor Andrew under an umbrella at the corner of the street, we could settle that matter in 5 minutes, if he is the man I take him for. But I hear he is sitting on his dignity and waiting for me to send for him. And at that rate, I learn there are 70 letters I don't know that anything can be done." Both Sumner and I assured him that Governor Andrew was precisely the man to meet him cordially and sensibly without parade and offhand. Mr. Seward received us in his dingy State Department. We spoke as we entered the anteroom, or rather in the corridor, with Governor Andrew and Mr. John Murray Forbes, who were waiting. Sumner led me along and upstairs and into the secretary's presence. He began, "Yes, I know Mr. Emerson," and he proceeded to talk a little when Sumner said, "I met Governor Andrew waiting outside. Shan't I call him in?" "Oh, yes," said Seward. Sumner went out and brought him in, and Mr. Forbes. Mr. Seward took from the shelf a large half-smoked cigar, lighted, and pulled at it. Sumner went into a corner with Andrew, and Mr. Forbes seized the moment to say to the secretary that he saw there was an effort making to get Gordon the slave trader pardoned. He hoped the government would show to foreign nations that there was a change and a new spirit in it, which would not deal with this crime as heretofore. Seward looked very cross and ugly at this, twisted his cigar about, and I thought twisted his nose also, and said coarsely, "Well, perhaps you would be willing to stand in his place," or something like that, and rather surprised and disconcerted Mr. Forbes. But Mr. Forbes, seeing that though we had risen to go, Sumner still talked with Andrew, went up to him, put his hands about him, and said, "Don't you see you are obstructing the public business?" or somewhat to that effect, and so we made our adieus. Mr. Seward came up to me and said, "Will you come to church with me tomorrow at 10:15, and we will go home afterwards and get some lunch or dinner?" I accepted, and Sumner then carried me into some of the chambers of the department, into the office of Mr. Hunter, who has been chief clerk, I believe, he said, for 14 or 15 years. Into the library, where Mr. Derby presided, and where I found Gorowski at his desk growling. Into the chamber where the treaties with foreign nations, some of them most sumptuously engrossed and bound and enclosed, were shown us, as the Belgian treaty, and a treaty with the French Republic, signed by Bonaparte, countersigned by Talleyrand, and far richer than all the Siamese treaty and presents. Siamese, I think not Japanese treaty, tied up with the rich red silken ropes and tassels, and the sublime of the tea-caddy style, written as on moonlight. Then in another chamber the Washington papers, bought of Judge Washington by Congress for $20,000, were shown us. We opened several volumes to see the perfect method and clerical thoroughness with which Washington did all his work. I turned to the page on which the opinion of Marquis de Lafayette was given in answer to a requisition of the general before the Battle of Yorktown, volumes of original letters, etc., of Washington. All these inestimable books preserved in plain wooden cabinets here on the ground floor, not defended from fire, and any eager autograph hunter might scale the windows and carry them off. We then went to Lord Lyons and had a pleasant interview. He told us that the Queen had sent him the Order of the Bath, etc., on which Sumner congratulated him. Sumner insisted on carrying me to Baron Geralt, the Dean of the Diplomatic Corps, as the oldest resident, saying that nothing could be more charming than he and his family, his daughters looking like pastel pictures, and he told me very pleasing anecdotes of his intercourse with the Baron. President Lincoln had said to Sumner, "If I could see Lord Lyons, I could show him in 5 minutes that I am heartily for peace." Sumner had thought nothing could be more desirable, but it would not do to come between Seward and the President, nor tell Seward, who would embroil them, nor tell Lord Lyons, whom it would embarrass. So he had gone to Baron Geralt to state to him the President's remark and ask his counsel. The Baron was enchanted with the expression of the President, but agreed with Sumner it was impossible to put them, President and Lord Lyons, face to face without grave impropriety and mischief. And Seward and Lyons, it seems, are strangers and do not understand each other, whilst Lyons and Sumner are on the most confidential footing. Well, now that the prisoners are surrendered, Sumner went to Lyons and told him what had passed, and he too was very much gratified with it, and thanked Sumner for not telling him before, as it would have only distressed him. Meantime, I did not see the Baron, who was ill in bed, nor the pastel daughters. We called on the Russian minister, but he was not at home. As Judge Chase had invited us to dine with him at 5 o'clock, we went thither and saw his pretty daughter Kate, who alone with her father did the honors of the house. Mr. Chase said, "Slavery was not to be destroyed by a stroke, but in detail. I have 12,000 boys, slaves, at Port Royal whom I am organizing and paying wages for their work, and teaching them to read and to maintain themselves. I have no objection to put muskets in their hands by and by. I have 2 men, Mr. Reynolds and Edward L. Pierce, who are taking the care, and I want Congress to give me a little box of government, about as big as that escritoire, 2 or 3 officers, a superintendent, etc., and I think we shall get on very well." He and Sumner appeared to agree entirely in their counsels. They both held that as soon as a state seceded, it gave up its state organization, but did not thereby touch the national government. The moment Arkansas or Mississippi seceded, they would have said, "Certainly, if you do not like your state government, surrender it, and you lapse instantly into United States territory again." And they would have sent immediately a territorial governor to the first foot of that land, which they could reach, and have established United States power in the old form. From Mr. Chase we went to General Fremont, but unhappily he had stepped out and Mrs. Fremont detained us, because he would surely step in again in a few minutes. She was excellent company, a musical indignation, a piece of good sense and good humor, but incessantly accusing the government of the vast wrong that had been done to the general, how Senator Wade had read all their documents, Wade the chairman of the Joint Committee of Inquiry of the 2 houses, and had expressed himself in terms more terse than elegant to her on the outrage done to Fremont, and she sat wondering when the report of the committee was to burst like a shell on the government. She introduced me to Major Zaglioni, the captain of Fremont's bodyguard, the hero of Springfield, Missouri, the soldierly figure, who said that he was, quote, "as well as his inactive life permitted," end quote. She showed me 2 letters of her son who had once been designed for our Concord school, but when she came to find how much his reading, spelling, and writing had been neglected in his camp education, for he could ride and perform the sword exercise, but was a shocking bad writer, she was afraid to send him among cultivated boys, and had sent him into Connecticut, where he had made already great progress. She showed me 2 of his letters in proof, one written at his first coming to school, very rude, and one later showing great improvement. The next morning at 10:15 I visited Mr. Seward in his library, who was writing, surrounded by his secretary and some stockbrokers. After they were gone, I said, "You never come to Massachusetts?" "No," he said, "I have neither had the power nor the inclination." His father died early and left him the care, not only of his own family, but of his cousin's property, 3 fiduciary trusts, and he had much on his hands. Then he early saw that whatever money he earned was slipping away from him, and he must put it in brick and stone, if he would keep it. And he had later acquired a tract of land in Chautauqua County, which by care and attention had become valuable, and all this had occupied him until after he came into public life, and for the last 15 years he had been confined in Washington. Besides, Massachusetts was under a cotton aristocracy, and Mr. Webster worked for them. He did not like them, and had as much as he could do to fight the cotton aristocracy in his own state. So he had never gone thither on general politics. He said, "I am a peacemaker. I never work in another method. Men are so constituted that the possession of force makes the demonstration of force quite unnecessary. If I am 6 feet high and well proportioned, and my adversary is 4 feet high and well proportioned, I need not strike him. He will do as I say." On the day when the political power passed over the free states, the fate of slavery was sealed. I saw it was only a question of time, and I have remained in that belief. I was not wise enough to foresee all that has happened since. But it is not important. All was then settled, and is turning out as I expected. All the incidents must follow, both at home and abroad. England and France are only incidents. There is no resisting this. The Supreme Court follows too. Grier and Wayne at this moment are just as loyal as any judges. But he spoke as if all was done and to be done by him, by the executive, and with little or no help from Congress. They do nothing. Why, there are 12 points which I gave them at the beginning of the session, on which I wish the action of the government legitimated, and they have not yet touched one of them. And I am liable for every one of these parties whom I have touched in acting for the government. And the moment I go out of office, I shall put my property into my hands of my heirs, or it might all be taken from me by the people. We went to church. I told him I hoped he would not demoralize me. I was not much accustomed to churches, but trusted he would carry me to a safe place. He said he attended Reverend Dr. Pine's church. On the way we met Governor Fish, who was also to go with him. Miss Seward, to whom I had been presented, accompanied us. I was a little awkward in finding my place in the Common Prayer Book, and Mr. Seward was obliging in guiding me from time to time, but I had the older wonder come over me at the Egyptian stationariness of the English Church. The hopeless blind antiquity of life and thought, indicated alike by prayer and creed and sermon, was wonderful to see, and amid worshippers and in times like these. There was something exceptional, too, in the doctor's sermon. His church was all made up of secessionists. He had remained loyal, they had all left him and abused him in the papers. And in the sermon he represented his grief and preached Jacobitish passive obedience to powers that be as his defense. In going out, Mr. Seward praised the sermon. I said that the doctor did not seem to have read the Gospel according to San Francisco, or the Epistle to the Californians. He had not quite got down into these noisy times. Mr. Seward said, "Will you go and call on the President? I usually call on him at this hour." Of course I was glad to go. We found in the President's chamber his 2 little sons, boys of 7 and 8 years perhaps, whom the barber was dressing and whiskeying their hair, as he said, not much to the apparent contentment of the boys when the cologne got into their eyes. The eldest boy immediately told Mr. Seward he could not guess what they had got. Mr. Seward, quote, bet $0.25 that he could. Was it a rabbit? Was it a bird? Was it a pig? End quote. He guessed always wrong, and paid his quarter to the youngest before the eldest declared it was a rabbit. But he sent away the mulatto to find the President, and the boys disappeared. The President came, and Mr. Seward said, "You have not been to church today." No, he said, and if he must make a frank confession, he had been reading for the first time Mr. Sumner's speech on the Trent affair. Something was said of newspapers. and of the story that appeared in the journals of someone who selected all the articles which Marcy should read, etc., etc., the president incidentally remarked that for the New York Herald he certainly ought to be much obliged to it, for the part had been taken for the government in the Mason and Slidell business. Then Seward said somewhat to explain the apparent steady malignity of the London Times. It was all an affair of the great interests of markets. The great capitalists had got this or that stock. As soon as anything happens that affects their value, this value must be made real, and the Times must say just what is required to sell those values, etc., etc. The government had little or no voice in the matter. But what news today? Mr. Fox has sent none. Send for Mr. Fox. The servant could not find Mr. Fox. The president said he had the most satisfactory communication from Lord Lyons. Also had been notified by him that he had received the Order of the Bath. He, the president, had received 2 communications from the French minister. France, the moment of hearing the surrender of the prisoners, had ordered a message of gratification to be sent, without waiting to read the grounds. Then, when the dispatches had been read, had hastened to send a fresh message of thanks and gratulation. Spain also had sent a message of the same kind. He was glad of this that Spain had done, for he knew that, though Cuba sympathized with secession, Spain's interest lay the other way. Spain knew that the secessionists wished to conquer Cuba. Mr. Seward told the president somewhat of Dr. Pine's sermon, and the president said he intended to show his respect for him some time by going to hear him. We left the president and returned to Mr. Seward's house. At dinner, his 2 sons, Frederick, his private secretary, and William, I think, with Miss Seward, were present. Mr. Seward told the whole story of the conversation with the Duke of Newcastle. On seeing the absurd story in the English papers, he wrote to Thurlow Weed to go to the Duke and ask an explanation. Mr. Weed called on the Duke, who said that he was exceedingly grieved that he had given publicity to the circumstances, but the facts were substantially as they had been stated in the Times. Now, said Seward, I will tell you the whole affair as it happened. When those people came here, I gave them a precise program for their whole journey, which they exactly kept. If they went to the prairie, it was because I had so set it down. If they went to New York or to Boston, I had so directed. If they were received at the White House instead of being sent to a hotel in Washington, I had so directed. I did not go to meet them at Philadelphia or New York or Boston, but kept away. But at last, when they were ready to leave the country, I went to Albany to dine with them at Governor Morgan's. There were 24 or 25 at table, and there never were people more happy than they were. They were entirely gratified and thankful for all that had been done for them, and at the course of the tour. The conversation lapsed at table, as it will, into tete-a-tetes, and I occasionally spoke across the table to the Duke, and said to him that I had not joined them at Boston or at New York. Indeed, that as there was always a certain jealousy of England in the dominant Democratic party, and I wished to serve them and keep up the most friendly feeling in the country toward them, I had avoided going too much to them. Well, they all understood it, and we parted. Both the prince and the duke expressed their gratitude and good feeling to me in language which I cannot repeat, it was so complimentary. Mr. Seward said that his most intimate friend had been for very many years Mr. Thurlow Weed of Albany. He was in habit of fullest correspondence with him on all subjects, and every year on the 1st of January Mr. Weed's daughter has my last year's letters bound up into a volume. And there they lie, all 12 volumes of my letters on her center table, open to all to read them who will. In all this talk, Mr. Seward's manner and face were so intelligent and amiable that I, who had thought him so ugly the day before, now thought him positively handsome. Mr. Moseley told me at Buffalo that there was a time when he thought Mr. Seward was in danger of being only a moral demagogue, and I think was only saved from it by Mr. Weed's influence. This was written in later, says the editor. At 6 o'clock I obeyed Mrs. Hooper's invitation and went to dine for the second time that day. I found Mr. Hooper and his son and daughters, Governor and Mrs. Andrew, and Mrs. Schuyler. Governor Andrew had much to say of Mr. Seward. He thought that he had surpassed all men in the bold attempt at gassing other people and pulling wool over their eyes. He thought it very offensive. He might be a donkey, a good many men are, but he didn't like to have a man by his practice show that he thought him one. I told him that I had much better impressions of Mr. Seward, but I did not relate to him any conversations. Mrs. Schuyler, I found, had very friendly feelings toward Mr. Seward, and I found he had told her the same story about the prince in Newcastle. She told me how much attached Talleyrand when in his country had been to her grandfather, General Hamilton, that after his death he had borrowed a miniature portrait of him, of Mrs. Hamilton, that Mrs. Hamilton had begged him to bring it back to her, but he had refused and had carried it with him to France, that when Colonel Burr was in Paris he had written a note to Talleyrand expressing his wish to call on him and asking him to appoint an hour. Talleyrand did not wish to see him, but did not know how to decline it, so he wrote him a note saying that he was ready to see him when he should call, but he thought it proper to say that the picture of Colonel Hamilton always hung in his cabinet. Burr never called. I ought not to omit that, when Sumner introduced me to Mr. Welles, Secretary of the Navy, and asked him if there were anything new, Mr. Welles said, "No, nothing of importance," and then remarked that he observed the journals censured him for sending vessels drawing too much water in the Burnside expedition. Now, he said, this was not the fault of his department. We, the Navy, only sent 17, I think, vessels and all the 100 sail, and the War Department sent all the rest. He had nothing to do with them, and the overdrawing vessels were all store ships and transports, etc., of the War Department's sending. I breakfasted with Mr. Robbins, with Mr. Sherman of the Senate, and Colfax of the House. In talking with the last, he said that Congress had not yet come up to the point of confiscating slaves of rebel masters, no, but only such as were engaged in military service. I said, "How is it possible Congress can be so slow?" He replied, "It is owing to the great social power here in Washington of the border states. They step into the place of the Southerners here and wield the same power." When I told Sumner what Seward had said to me about England and Duke of Newcastle, he replied, "He has not been frank with you. I have heard him utter the most hostile sentiments to England." Sumner showed me several English letters of much interest which he had just received from Bright, from the Duke of Argyll, and from the Duchess of Argyll, all relating to our politics and pressing emancipation. Bright writes that thus far the English have not suffered from the war, but rather been benefited by stopping manufacturing and clearing out their old stocks, and bringing their trade into a more healthy state. But after a few months they will be importunate for cotton. The Duchess of Argyll sent Sumner some fine lines of Tennyson written at the request of Lord Dufferin for the tomb of his mother. The architect of the Capitol is Mr. Walter of Boston. I spent Sunday evening at the house of Charles Eames, late minister to Venezuela, whom I knew many years since at the Carlton House, New York. At his house I found many new and some old acquaintances, Governor Fish, Governor Andrew, N.P. Willis, Gorowski, Mr. Nicolay, the President's private secretary, and another young gentleman who shares, I believe, the same office, and is also, I was told, a contributor to the Atlantic Monthly, but whose name I have forgotten. Young Robert Lincoln, the President's son, was also there, and Lutz the painter, who invited me to see his pictures, which he is painting for a panel in the Capitol. The Immigration to the West. No military people, I think, were present, and when I went home at a late hour I was vexed to have forgotten that Mr. Secretary Stanton had invited me to call on him at his house this evening. I was delighted with the Senate chamber in the Capitol and its approaches. I did not remember in France or in England that their legislative bodies were nobly housed. The staircase and surrounding chambers are sumptuous and beautiful. The structure is so large that I needed a guide and could not find my way out after I left Spofford. It is the fault of the building that the new wings are built in a larger style, so that the columns of the center look small and the Capitol fronts the wrong way, its back being towards the present city of Washington. It was designed that the city should occupy the other slope and face the Capitol, but the owners of the land held prices so high that people bought the other side of the Capitol, and now the city is grown there. In the Congressional Library, I found Spofford, assistant librarian. He told me that for the last 12 years it had been under Southern domination, and as under dead men. Thus the medical department was very large, and the theological very large, whilst of modern literature very imperfect. There was no copy of the Atlantic Monthly or of the Knickerbocker, none of the Tribune or Times or any New York journal. There was no copy of the London Saturday Review taken or any other live journal but the London Court Journal, in 100 volumes, duly bound. Nor was it possible to mend matters, because no money could they get from Congress, though an appropriation had been voted. After this follows a untranslated poem from Pennard. At this hour, when the magnitude of the stake is of the existence of liberty in this country and the preservation of the liberty of mankind, when the value of a vote is of value to the whole world of sober men, I cannot affect to speak politely of the idle party who, professing to hate slavery, can divide the vote of Massachusetts on this question. It is casting firebrands and saying, "Am I not in sport?" It is a dastardly treachery. They strew sugar on this bottled spider, and as if it were a small thing, as if it were indifferent who governed, they peril the safety of mankind. I can understand it of the old who have ceased to think or to be responsible, men good in their time, but now in their easy chairs. But for the men in their manhood to join with these for some petty griefs or personalities, or for good following, and because they have eaten too much pound cake, it argues an incurable frivolity of character, which has all the effect of a wilful treason. Plenty of men. No lack of men in the rail cars. In the hotels going to see Cubas or Booth, caravans of men going to Idaho mines, to Pike's Peak, to Lake Superior. Quote, "A strong army and a good fleet, which neither foot nor horse is able to follow, cannot be denied to land where it list, for ships, without putting themselves out of breath, will easily outrun the soldiers that coast them." End quote. Quote, "A fleet may sail in one night from point to point, but an army could not span in 6 days." End quote. Sir Walter Raleigh. Majorities, the argument of fools, the strength of the weak. One should recall that Laertius records of Socrates' opinion of the common people that, quote, "it was as if a man should object against a piece of bad money and accept a great sum of the same." End quote. Varnhagen von Enns says that after all wars in Germany, the aristocracy grows strong. In the 30 Years' War, in the 7 Years, and in the Emancipation War. Frederick the Great weeded out every officer not noble from his army. Dr. Erhard told of a fellow who reeled drunk out of a gin shop, and hearing the cannonade on account of the capture of Paris, cried out, "There, do you hear? War is over. The nobility have conquered." Erhard thought this chap had shown the deepest political insight. Quote, "When the government fears, that is already a step forward," end quote, "for the people," said Gans. Then there's an untranslated quotation from Varnhagen, Volume 1, page 29. For example, there comes a time when books once printed with impunity now make too much impression and are suppressed. This is the end of Part 1 of Journal Collection number 53, dating from the year 1862, when the author was 59 years old. Thank you for listening.